activism doesn't allow diversity of thought. But science must have diversity of thought if it is going to get its goal of pursuing the truth. And that pursuit of the truth is what is needed to really inform society and its particular actions. It's to the benefit of society. It is also a benefit to itself to just simply know what is true and real. If you've been on this channel a few times, you know that I've had my concerns about the way certain things are going in academia, which is where we train the next generation of scientists, and discussed some of those commentary and how different surveys, from the College Free Expression survey to the Heterodox Academy campus survey to numbers of different surveys, have pointed out that numbers of students have repeatedly expressed how they don't feel comfortable to work in a particular, to be on a particular campus, or to be on any campus, and how some of this is particularly true of students and faculty that are more conservative in persuasion. And I wanted to hit on something about that, with a combination of articles. First one, this from the Hill, and then from Sarah Hayter's Substack, which, if you were watching one of the Side Chat Saturdays, you know that Lee Jussum recommended that to me, and I found it, dug it up, and wanted to go through it. And I think this is to make the point here, and the overall thesis for today, just so you're following along, is that activism and science don't go together. They're pretty much antithetical to each other. And we want to get into that here, because the story here is going to describe from the start, what was a great working environment for this professor who notes himself as a conservative. And again, as it says here, it's an opinion piece, so you have your own opinions, please feel free to express them. And then there is the other take of what happens when you get lots of activists involved. And we'll see a difference, and I think Sarah Hayter provides a really great description, though I think I'll add a little bit of one piece to it when we get there. I'm a conservative. Is there still a place for me in the field of political science? This is Robert Maranto writing for The Hill. This week, thousands of social scientists are meeting in Los Angeles for the 119th Annual American Political Science Association meeting. Now, for those of you who wonder what exactly political science is, basically the definition of that is it is a science that is about the study of governments, public policies, and political behavior in the United States and abroad. So that is what technically that discipline is supposed to be up to. I've attended nearly every APSA meeting since 1984, a third of its existence, and most of my life. Seeing old friends, new books, and countless panels exploring politics is the highlight of my year, even though I am one of roughly 10% of political scientists, not all on the down low, who usually vote Republican. But will academia remain open to people like me and to the unique perspectives we bring? Until recently, I assured libertarians and conservatives that, unlike much of academia, political science had a tent big enough for them. Today, as academia becomes as leftist as Rush Limbaugh always said we were, I'm not so sure. Now, there's, again, very big differences between political sciences and STEM, but I do want to make a point with all of this. It was not always that way. As a first-generation college student at the University of Maryland, I was mentored by a social democrat who in class occasionally needled me about my politics, but who also graded my papers fairly. Now, there's one point I want to make on this, is that one of the things that has shown up in surveys pretty consistently now is that students are afraid to express their opinions on certain things out of fear, in part, of being marked down by a professor. And in some cases have had that happen. So, just a note there. He urged me to apply to the top 10 PhD program at the University of Minnesota and wrote me a recommendation, which helped me win a graduate fellowship there in 1980. Decades later, we still keep in touch. My dissertation advisor at Minnesota, Charles Walcott, also leaned left. He nonetheless exposed me to a range of ideas, encouraged me when I posed novel questions from a conservative perspective, and helped me get my dissertation published as a scholarly book. In it, I empirically demonstrated that the Reagan administration was not uniformly anti bureaucracy, but rather supported defense agencies, generally opposed social welfare and regulatory agencies, and had varied approaches elsewhere. Most conflicts between Reagan political appointees and career bureaucrats reflected legitimate policy disagreements about priorities rather than clashes between extremist politicians and expert bureaucrats. Hang on a sec. There we go. When my book criticizing the work of leading presidency scholar James P. Fiftner, when my book criticized the work of leading presidency scholar James P. Fiftner, he responded by modifying some of his views, promoting my work, and helping me get a job in the Clinton bureaucracy. Like many others, Jim showed me how to be a real social scientist. I thought about that a decade later when praising a terrific book by Vanderbilt political scientist David Lewis, which empirically undermined some of my findings. These anecdotes above from my own career demonstrated the open-mindedness that once characterized my field. As political scientist Richard M. Merrilman detailed in Pluralism at Yale, in the mid and late 20th century, the nation's leading political science department enshrined pluralism rather than Marxism or traditionalism as the field's dominant paradigm. Pluralists value disagreement. We don't purge dissenters. By temperament, pluralists oppose both McCarthyism and Marxism. Marxism, and I want to make a point here just to remind folks about this. The current things with critical theory, critical social justice, postmodern thoughts, all of that has its roots in Marxism, and it doesn't tolerate dissent. See cynical theories is a good example of that. There's plenty of examples in there of how basically in that literature of critical theories and what have you, the postmodernism, the colloquial woke. In fact, hold on a second. If you haven't gotten this is a good book to get. This is Counter Wokecraft. Charles Pincourt and James Lindsay here writing it, but they provide probably the best definition of woke that I have read, and I think it's probably a good idea to point it out here in terms of exactly what it is and some of the worldviews. So let me read a moment here from this. Woke is a term given to both the worldview and to the people who are initiated and adhere to that worldview. The worldview is known under several pseudonyms: critical perspective, social justice, and the critical social justice perspective. It is described in section 1.2 below. It is an amalgam of postmodern and critical theory. The term woke is simply the past tense of the verb to wake, and it is intended to mean awoken to the CSJ worldview, critical social justice. While the term derives from the CSJ perspective and is used proudly as a self-identifying moniker, the same term is used pejoratively amongst those critical of the perspective. So, let's see. Flip over a page here. Let's see. The woke worldview encompasses a number of different theories relating to inequality between different groups in society. As such, the term includes critical race theory, queer theory, post-colonial theory, and fat studies, to name a few of the main ones. The key difference between the various approaches to critical social justice really has to do with which group of the theories concentrate on. Critical race theory is about race, queer theory emphasizes non-cisgendered people, and post-colonial theory emphasizes colonized or previously colonized peoples. What is the woke perspective? Ultimately, there are three main principles that bind many different flavors of woke together: the knowledge principle, the political principle, and the subject principle. The knowledge principle. The first is that while reality itself is not denied or questioned, it is considered impossible for us to know its true nature. The reason it's impossible for us to know about reality's true nature is that any knowledge we think we have is actually only socially constructed. Now, this is woke perspective, by the way, not mine. Defined through language by the culture in which we live. Critical for this principle is the fact that different cultures have different understandings about the nature of the world. After examining the political principle, the importance of this last point will become clear. The political principle is that not only is knowledge socially constructed, but knowledge is constructed by oppressor groups in society at the expense of oppressed groups. The construction of knowledge is done through language whose rules are determined by groups with the power to do so, i.e. oppressor groups. Moreover, knowledge is constructed in such a way that it helps maintain the oppressive role for oppressive groups and to prevent oppressed groups from being liberated from their oppression. This is taken to imply that not only is any knowledge socially constructed, but it is by definition biased and can't be an accurate representation of reality. This, together with the fact that different cultures have different understandings of the nature of the world, implies that no worldview is more authoritative than any other. As such, all worldviews are epistemically, I can't pronounce that word, equivalent in terms of their ability to know anything about reality, and amount simply to different stories about reality. So, for example, the scientific worldview has no greater claim to understanding reality than any other story. That is, a scientific worldview is no truer than a religious worldview or even a superstitious worldview. Moreover, the scientific worldview, developed by white European males, constructs knowledge about reality in such a way as to perpetuate systems of oppression that benefit oppressor white European males. As such, even the tools used to understand the world according to the scientific worldview, such as logic, argument, evidence, hypotheses, controlled experiments, etc., serve to perpetuate oppression. The subject principle is that individuals are primarily defined by their group identity. And I'm going to hold that one there because the rest of that isn't entirely relevant for what I was going to say here. But the oppressor-oppressed thing in there that you see is in Marxism, the dialectic. Marx did a very similar thing of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And more on that can be found with New Discourses in James Lindsay. But this is just simply to make the point that Marxism is opposed. And yes, if you're pluralist, you're probably going to be opposing postmodernist thought, the colloquial woke, also. Pluralists likewise endorse the scientific method, what Karl Popper called conjectures and refutations, even when hypothesis testing undermines our beliefs. For pluralists, science requires disagreement, without which it loses both its legitimacy and its ability to ask novel questions. Now, this is where I want to say to the point here. Purpose of scientists, purpose of the university, purpose of scholarship, to get at the truth, above and beyond anything else. Not narratives. What is true? What is that objective reality? If you're working in the postmodernist frame, you claim you can't get at it because you're they basically are very hostile to the idea of objective reality existing in the postmodern frame of reference. But because you're trying to get at the truth, you inherently need diverse perspectives, which means you can't throw anybody out for their opinions on something. You can't throw out people from different perspectives that you dislike. You have to bring them in and allow them to question and challenge your own potential biases about a subject in that collective and shared goal of getting at what the truth is. That's also part of Enlightenment thinking, liberalism, classical liberalism, mind you, not the progressivism, and the like there. Unfortunately, pluralism is fading. I fear in my remaining years, I'm 65, no conservative scholar will lead the APSA, even though as recently as the 1990s, James Wilson and Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom did so. From what I can tell, not a single open Republican now serves on the 31-member APSA governing council. That leaves half the country unrepresented politically in an organization whose job it is to promote political research about all the country and the world. Reflecting behind-the-scenes pressure from activists since the 2012 conference in New Orleans, the APSA annual meeting has not occurred in a red state, with only one in a purple state, Philadelphia in 2016. Last year, APSA met in Montreal, but it seems unlikely that we might meet in Dallas, Phoenix, Chicago, or Charlotte, or Orlando. I have seen other things similar happen with some of the professional societies on the STEM side arguing, we can't have something in that state because of X policy that state has. That's not, particularly for a STEM discipline, that doesn't frickin' matter. But this is the problem. You're eroding the notion of pluralism. Anyway, in 2021, activist threats of violence led the APSA annual conference at the last minute to move online its 10 panels involving the right-wing Claremont Institute because of Claremont's association with John Eastman. Oh boy. John Eastman, who currently faces disbarment and a criminal trial for election interference in Georgia. Okay, he's wrapped up in the cases in Georgia, so I'm not going to dive into that. Point is, they threatened the APSA because they didn't like the institute because it had an association with somebody. Rather than hold its panels online, Claremont pulled out altogether, which seemed to be what some wanted. I detest Eastman's views on the peaceful transfer of power, and more to the point, he was simply wrong in many of the assertions that underpinned his arguments. But I also believe that scholars fight bad ideas of all political varieties with debate, not banishment, and certainly not through guilt by institutional association with those who hold erroneous or even detestable viewpoints. Further, ending its longtime association with Claremont leaves APSA without any significant organized conservative presence, which is a travesty for representation. Notably, the Claremont panels were always among the best attended at APSA annual meetings. 2 years on, APSA should bring back Claremont or something like it. When I mention the lack of representation, older APSA members admit it's a problem. For younger members raised under the spell of critical theory, i.e., postmodernist woke crap, responses are mixed. In the meantime, many conservatives, including some anti-Trumpers like myself, have just given up, keeping their heads low in a sort of academic Benedict option. Yet ultimately, giving up on pluralism is giving up on the American Political Science Association and on America itself. And I would say, I wanted to tell the story because what happens when you just start teaching from one perspective and you don't allow different perspectives? The younger generation drifts toward that one perspective, and you have no diversity of thought. And diversity of thought is what matters in all sciences, not just political science, but in any science. But what I'm reminded of is, in reading that, was this piece from Sarah Hayter from 2022 on effective activism and intellectual honesty, in which she actually breaks down quite nicely the difference between activism and scholarship. I really actually immensely appreciate this, and this is where I get back to the point here. When you start embedding activism in an institution that is meant to do truth-seeking, even though it's political science, it's about getting at the truth. It is still a discipline of research. It is still a discipline of some kind of science. It's a social science. But anytime you start embedding an activist mindset into a discipline that's supposed to be about truth-seeking, what are you going to end up with? You're chasing out people who could give you that diversity of thought. And ironically, in the name of supposedly being inclusive and tolerant, you're being exclusive of diverse viewpoints. It's amazing how that works. So, on Twitter recently, I noticed two writers in a tussle with anti-CRT activist Christopher Rufo. They claim he was unprincipled, a charge he denied. Now infamous for his unrelenting social media campaigns against the woke left, and even a profile at the New York Times, Rufo has become a force to be reckoned with. His new stardom has disturbed many, including some liberals known for their own criticisms of the woke left. I don't always agree with Rufo, but I agree with him to a degree here. Regardless of whether or not the charges of dishonesty are true, he says that his opponents don't understand the rules of his game. He is right. There is a fundamental disconnect between the functions of two different classes of discourse participants, those who use language to think and discover truth, and those who use it as a means to power. Scholar and scientist is after think and discovering truth. Scholar and scientist is over there. Activist is over there. In temperament, instinct, and preference, I am powerfully predisposed to the thinker camp. When I look at someone like Chris Rufo, I have much the same feelings of frustration as others like me. He is a self-proclaimed partisan with a clear political agenda. He frames his language to ease black and white thinking, actively stigmatizes certain groups and institutions, and harnesses the rage and fear of the resulting mob toward his goals. This happens on the other side too. To be fair, this is her opinion about Christopher Rufo. This all sounds very negative, and indeed, in many ways, it undeniably is. But I have actively engaged in activism for much of the last decade, living amongst the Romans, so to speak. I don't pretend to be incredibly accomplished, but I've studied the space closely. Compared to other thinkers, Rufo might be fairly accused of being dishonest. Compared to other activists, however, Rufo may be unusually honest. It took me some time to accept the dichotomy myself, especially the realities of what it might mean for my own abilities to be a highly successful activist. The activist game, to sum in one sentence, is about results. The goal of a good activist is to achieve the ends as quickly as possible, as ethically as this might allow. Her morality is rooted in the goodness of the ends she works toward. Indisputably, noble means to attain them are not required. It's about the narrative. It's about the thing you want to push. It's about power. That's the activist game, is what she's getting at with this. If it's about power and just getting there by any means necessary and making the world into whatever you think it should be, that is the antithesis of what it means to be a scientist and a scholar. Scientist and the scholar is in the second thing here. The thinker game is about truth. The goal is to uncover reality as it is, to achieve a true map of the real world, and hopefully to be the first to do it. You do like credit for that, yes, don't get me wrong. Reflecting reality requires honesty with oneself and with others, and a strict adherence to principled conduct. Although all fields have some degree of competition, knowledge building is inherently not a zero-sum game. Truth builds upon itself. The activist, meanwhile, lives in a world of scarcity, limited time, limited funds, limited public attention. To her, not winning is the same as losing. Every minute in which her goals are not achieved is a minute in which a harm has been achieved. There is a cost to delay. Meanwhile, from a thinker's perspective, the only activism that doesn't look like dishonorable demagoguery is, in practice, ineffective activism. So, what are we getting at with all this? The fear that's happened, and I've seen, we got into this a bit with Lee. The fear that I have with a lot of things going on in academia and the potential for this is that we have more and more scientists and scholars in academia, not just political science, but a lot of Lee talked about it with respect to the social sciences. Anna and I have talked about it with respect to the STEM sciences, that there are folks who want to be scholar activists. I'm sorry, you can't be both. You can't be both. Because an activist advances a narrative and doesn't give a damn about how they get there. They don't give a damn whether or not their research was done correctly, just that it actually supports something they already think, which is the wrong way to think about it. If you're actually doing scholarship, if you're actually doing science, you're asking and answering a question, and you're talking about the results, even if you hate what the results are, because it doesn't pre-confirm your viewpoint. And if you have others who who present something that disproves your original work, all of the other story here, then you take a look at it, you test it, you challenge it, and ultimately, if it's correct, you accept it. But an activist wouldn't do that. An activist would attack the person who produces something they dislike, which is, I think, what happened in the case of the Suzanne Diaz and Michael Bailey piece on ROGD. So that isn't therein the difference. But an activist doesn't allow different viewpoints as a result, because then you end up with, well, I can't advance to my goal because there's somebody here who is not allowing me to persuade others to my point. Years ago, I was asked on a podcast whether it's possible to be effective and intellectually honest in the activist space. I said no. There are many reasons why this is, but they can be boiled down to the unfortunate reality that we do not, as a population, think as we should. The best ideas do not always win. Quite frequently, they lose. Daniel Dennett summed it up more precisely in Consciousness Explained. Whether or not a, quote, meme replicates successfully is strictly independent of its epistemological virtue. It might spread in spite of its perniciousness or go extinct in spite of its virtue. The work of an activist is, in essence, the work of optimizing an idea for propagation and adoption, of turning the tides in its favor. As a mind that is either convinced or it isn't, she must compete to be more persuasive than her opponents. It is a zero-sum game. Therefore, she utilizes certain tactics to get ahead. Here's a short list of a few important ones. First, rhetoric that spreads easily and moves people to action is not the most nuanced. Careful distillation, in fact, is sure to be the opposite. It must be simple, clear, direct, light. Every layer of complexity, every additional ounce of nuance makes the idea heavier, slowing down its spread. Some ideas have an inherent advantage here, as they might be easier to collapse into a digestible form. Fundamental opposite of science, because you know how many nuances and detail and caveats and all this other kind of stuff you're doing if you're doing a research paper, right? One should not underestimate the power of a story. Stories hijack our thought processes astonishingly well, and they are the absolute best tool we have of conveying information in a form that will remain with the receiver. Now, actually, this has been confirmed in the communication literature, kind of thing I would point out. So, doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but it has been confirmed there. If you relay a story well enough, even normally discerning and skeptical people will not stop to think, hey, this sounds a little too simplistic. Their sense of empathy will motivate them to see things in your favor. Effective activists and movements must constantly attempt to capture public attention. Rarely does it land in your lap. Yep. Maybe a campaign? Yeah. If one is serious about activism, one must be willing to trade in personal dignity for awareness and support. While many activists are clear about what they want you to think, they are effectively also clear about what they want you to do next. All the attention and anger is pointless if it is not wielded to some end. I think this final point separates the high-quality, high-effective activists from those who merely have an intuitive feel for how to garner attention. Despite the worthiness of a cause, one must concede that they squandered the vigor. Okay, let's see. Does this sound like a list that optimizes for rational, honest, principled discourse? No, it does not. The famed sociologist Max Weber called it the tension between those who act in strict accordance with principle and followers of an ethic of responsibility, who must give an account of the foreseeable results of one's action. Weber did not believe that those who adopt the former are fit to participate in the political affairs of their logic. As their logic, cannot stand up under the ethical irrationality of the world. Reality, Weber describes, often forces morally dangerous action to end immorally. Morally dangerous action to end immorality. There we go. It is not the case that from good comes only good, and from evil only evil follows. Not only the whole course of world history, but every examination of everyday experience points to the opposite. Anyone who fails to see this is a political infant. That might be too harsh of a judgment, in my view. Rather than some kind of naivety or ignorance, it might be a simple case of crossed incentive. Thinkers might have trouble digesting the harsh requirements of power because it leads to the dispiriting realization that reasonable discourse, their bread and butter, is not often what moves most people. But followers of the opposing consequentialist ethic must accept the potential costs of dabbling with diabolical forces. No ethics in the world can dodge the fact that in numerous instances the attainment of good ends is bound to the fact that one must be willing to pay the price of using morally dubious means, or at least dangerous ones, and facing the possibility of even the probability of evil ramifications. The ideal political actor, in Weber's view, is one who can face these ethical paradoxes squarely and unflinchingly and accept responsibility for resulting unintended evils. More tellingly, he must also face what may become of himself. He must be willing to accept the possibility of his own corruption. See, activists want you to do something. They want certain policy actions. They want all this kind of stuff and what have you. It's all about power and getting certain things done. Scholars don't. Thinkers don't. They're about figuring out what the truth is, slowing down, figuring it out appropriately, and then acting on the right policy. But here is the thing. This might sound as a screed against the activist. It is not, nor do I hold any grudge against the thinkers. I extend mistrust, however, to those who claim to be able to meet the demands of both, without tension or inefficacy. This includes journalists and scholars who make an activist agenda plain, and even entire fields in academia that are founded on advancing certain worldviews. One of the two roles will necessarily be dominated by the other, its principles corrupted or its efforts undermined. There are no exceptions to this rule, no matter how well-meaning the actors, but many are too naive or too arrogant to recognize how little their intentions matter and how easily their work can be distorted. And of course, all this is making two big assumptions that can't possibly be true, not with humans anyway, that the thinkers are motivated purely by their search for the truth, and the activists are by the service of a worthy cause. This is true. We do make some assumptions here about this, and though obviously we all want to get at the truth, there are times that we are not motivated by that, for sure, as scholars go. So it's a fair critique there. It is easy to see how both the tactics of the activists and the power they may achieve can be used for selfish ends. But what about the thinkers? Many years ago, I was asked to take part in, well, a nude protest against Islamofascist patriarchy. Oh, jeez. I told myself the reason was this stunt would convince no one, that the real point of activism was to rationally persuade, and besides, I couldn't shake the and maybe I had a point. But if I'm going to be honest, I was unwilling to do it, even if success was guaranteed. I was unwilling to do it because my privacy was precious to me. How many other times? Okay. I remember once speaking to how many other times had a similar thought process motivated my judgment? How many times had I neglected some effective tactic because I refused to sacrifice something far more precious than time or money, my dignity? And isn't this too a form of selfishness? I remember once speaking to a friend, who happened to be a celebrated writer, about his distaste toward the activist class. For him, it went beyond honesty and principle. It was also a matter of style. Vulgar, I believed, was the word he used. And vulgarity is antithetical to the demands of prestige, or at least the wrong kind of vulgarity is. Not the deliberate libertine transgression of high-minded provocateurs, but the dull, sincere kind that is ignorance of his own tastelessness. The nobility of the search for the truth provides a cover for a more base desire, the desire for status among peers, and an unwillingness to sacrifice it for any cause. So we are left with, in the end, more uncertainty than we started with. When is an activist past the point of redemption? When does she become a mere propagandist? When does she begin to do more harm than good? And when does a high-minded intellectualism become in itself immoral and self-serving passivity to evil? I have a bit more to say about these matters, but not much of the way of easy answers, I'm afraid. The essay is too long as it is, so I'll leave you here. This video has already gotten long, so we'll cut to the end here. What she's getting at in the description between activists and scholars is very much of the thing, but she is also not wrong that scholars, to a degree, have to be acting in defense of their own nature, if you will. If you're going to be primarily focused on your pursuit of the truth, then you have to be willing to defend it from activists who want to make it anything but. And that is hard to get into. That is a hard thing to get into. But at the same time, an activist doesn't allow for anyone who is very different in their thoughts, as was kind of pointed out here. It doesn't allow for diversity of thought, as was kind of hinted at in the example with the Hill. It doesn't allow for diversity of thought. It doesn't allow for diversity of perspectives, and definitely postmodern woke stuff doesn't allow for that. So, in a point there that I want to make is that activism doesn't allow diversity of thought, but science must have diversity of thought if it is going to get at its goal of pursuing the truth. And that pursuit of the truth is what is needed to really inform society and its particular actions. It's to the benefit of society. It is also a benefit to itself to just simply know what is true and real. But you can't do that if you have an activism who just wants to see a particular view of the world, and will always do that. Scientists and activists are antithetical to each other. Now, there is one difference I do want to point out to this, and I think Lee is correct in this, in that you could have advocates. And what does that mean? Advocates have a dedication to what is true, yes. They also have a dedication to a cause, but because of their dedication to what is true, also, they recognize when their own ideas are false, or there's, faulty data, or their understanding is off about something, and update it, and then continue on with their activism and figure out how to approach it. This can be seen in folks who might change what they think about how to approach a policy decision or something like this, or, scientists who maybe I should think about it this way, or think about it that way, or, all those kinds of things if they're advocating for a particular thing, instead. So there is a middle ground there, I think, for sure. But this is a nice pair of docs in the long time debate and argumentation over whether or not scientists should be activists, which, again, I said it already, science and activism, antithetical, and more to the point here with specific issues in academia, postmodern thought, the colloquial woke, is fundamentally anti-science. And you can't be an activist and a scientist at the same time. You certainly can't be a postmodernist activist and a scientist at the same time. I don't think it works. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way at the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, everybody.